I didn't sleep that night. The wind picked up, howling through the mountains, but it wasn't just the wind anymore. That damn whistle. It cut through the night like a blade, sharp and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was doing it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. My eyes flicked to every shadow in the distance, but all I saw were the jagged silhouettes of rocks, cast long and distorted in the moonlight. The air felt alive. Too alive, like it was watching, waiting. Every gust of wind made the hairs on my arms stand straight. I tried to tell myself it was just a bird, or maybe a breeze playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, I was too exhausted to even process what had happened. But when I unzipped my tent, my stomach lurched in terror. I didn't see it right away. I should have. But when I stepped outside, there was something wrong, something off, about the way the dirt around my campsite had shifted. The ground was clawed up, deep gouges like animal tracks, but they were too large, too uneven. The dirt wasn't just scratched, it was ripped open, as though something huge, something feral, had scraped its way across the earth. The pattern was all wrong. These weren't the usual marks you'd see from a coyote or a bear. These were jagged, erratic, unnatural, like a hand. No. Claws had torn into the earth itself, digging deep into the soil. And as I stood there, I could feel something shift in the air. The temperature dropping, the tension thick and suffocating. But it wasn't just the ground that unnerved me. I turned, and my stomach sank like I'd been punched in the gut. My RV was parked nearby, and it was covered. At first, I thought it was some kind of shadow or dirt, but then I saw the truth. The sides of the RV were marked, covered in claw marks. Deep slashing gashes that went through the metal, tearing at the surface like some animal had used its talons to scratch at it for hours. No animal could have done that. No coyote. No bear. And I knew, even then, that whatever had made those marks was still out there, watching me, waiting. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at those scratches, my heart hammering in my chest. But something was off about the air. It was too still, too quiet. Not even the wind stirred. It was as if the desert had fallen silent in the face of whatever was stalking me. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, the adrenaline and fear coursing through me, making my head spin. Then, it came again. That whistle. But this time, it was different. This time, it was close. I whipped around, my heart thumping in my throat, the air thick with a sickening sense of dread. There was nothing there. Just the same jagged rocks and dead brush, the same oppressive desert stretching on for miles. But I could feel it. Feel something moving. Something unnatural. Just outside. The edge of my vision. A flicker in the shadows. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. I don't know how much time passed. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. But I couldn't stand there anymore. I grabbed my backpack, threw everything into the car, and started the engine. I was panicked, my hands shaking, the cold sweat sticking to my back. I didn't care about the damage to the RV or my gear. I needed to leave. But as I pulled away from the campsite, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure. It was standing in the distance, just on the edge of the road, too far to make out clearly. But there was no mistaking the shape of it. Tall, gaunt, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its head was tilted to the side, like it was studying me, watching me. Its body barely moved in the windless air, as though it was waiting. I slammed my foot down on the gas, the engine roaring as I sped down the road. The image of that thing seared into my mind. I tried to convince myself I was just imagining things. Maybe it was just some weird trick of the light, the kind of thing your mind plays on you when you're alone in the wilderness for too long. But the further I drove, the more I realized that whatever I had seen was real. And it was still following me. I could feel it. Every nerve in my body screaming. A constant weight on my chest. I didn't stop driving for hours. Not until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon and the oppressive, choking darkness began to lift. I finally pulled over at a small diner on the outskirts of the park, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. When I stepped out, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was like the air itself had shifted, thickened, as if the desert was holding its breath. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. The rangers at the entrance asked if everything had been okay, but I just nodded, muttering something about rough weather and needing a break. The whistle, the scratches, that thing, I didn't want to talk about it. I couldn't. They wouldn't believe me. But I wasn't the only one who heard it. Weeks later, I found out through a series of whispers and rumors from other campers who had been in Big Bend that same night. They had heard the same damn whistle, the same scratching, the same feeling of being hunted. Some of them hadn't stuck around long enough to see the damage I had witnessed on my RV. Others had. But they had all said the same thing. They saw something out there. Something tall and strange. Something unnatural. Park rangers were baffled. They found no evidence of any wildlife in the area. No tracks, no clues. Just the claw marks. Just the strange, eerie whistling in the night. They claimed it was just a freak occurrence, a fluke. But I knew better. I had felt it. I had seen it. And I knew it was still out there. That night, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear that whistle. Clear as ever. Too close. Too real. I didn't dare look out the window. I couldn't. I could still feel the weight of those eyes on me, the oppressive feeling that had followed me from the desert. And somewhere, out there, in the silent, endless dark, something was waiting for me to come back. Something was watching, listening for that familiar, terrified sound. But this time, I wouldn't make the mistake of running. Next time, it would find me. It was August of 2019. I remember because it was the first time I questioned reality itself. Kelly and I had been planning the RV trip for months. City life had worn us thin, and the idea of disappearing into the barren quiet of the Oklahoma Panhandle seemed like the reset we both needed. Just us, open skies, and miles of nothing. I wanted nothing more than silence. Be careful what you wish for. The RV park was little more than a gravel lot off Highway 412. A few other rigs were parked at a distance, their lights flickering in the gathering dusk. We didn't talk much that evening. I remember how the air felt. It hung heavy, too thick for a summer breeze. It wasn't the warmth that made me sweat. It was that feeling, you know? When something's watching. Just out of sight, Kelly was inside making dinner, humming some old tune, but I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. I chalked it up to being tired and stepped back inside, locking the RV door behind me. As if that lock would have done anything. By the time the storm alert came through my phone, I could barely hear the rain outside. Tornado warning. Kelly glanced over my shoulder, reading the message with me. We need to move. Now. Her voice was sharp, pressing, but I just stood there, staring at the screen. I couldn't explain it, but something in me, something primal, said not to run. The map showed the storm was barreling straight for us, a crimson blotch devouring everything in its path. I could hear the wind screaming now, rocking the RV in uneven jerks. Kelly was throwing things into bags, ready to bolt, but I couldn't move. "Ethan! Let's go!" she shouted. And then it stopped. The wind, the rain, everything. 1 second the world was tearing itself apart. The next, nothing. No breeze. No rattle of rain against the windows. Kelly froze, half-zipped duffel bag in hand, staring at the sudden stillness. The only sound left was the soft hum of our refrigerator. I don't know how long we stood there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. The sky outside was dark, but not with clouds. It was empty, blank. No stars, no moon. Just blackness pressing against the glass. I stepped outside. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd see the tornado in the distance, or feel the pressure drop. Instead, I found something far worse. A mile away, where the RV park's office should have been, there was nothing but torn earth. Like something had reached down and scooped the land clean. I could see the trail, a narrow path of destruction cutting clean through the horizon, yet our RV sat untouched, like a toy forgotten by a careless child. Kelly stepped out behind me, clinging to my arm. I felt her trembling, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The lights from the other RVs were gone. The rigs were still there, but the people were missing. There were no signs of struggle. Doors hung open. Camping chairs sat around extinguished fire pits. Everything looked left behind. A low, groaning noise echoed from somewhere distant. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like something dragging across gravel, slow and deliberate. I turned to Kelly, ready to tell her we needed to leave. But the words died in my throat. She was staring past me, her face pale as bone. "There's someone standing by the fence," she whispered. I didn't want to look. I had to. Across the empty lot, by the rusted chain-link fence marking the edge of the property, stood a figure. Tall. Still. I could make out no features, just a silhouette darker than the night behind it. It didn't move. It didn't sway with the wind, because there was no wind. I grabbed Kelly's hand and pulled her inside. We locked the doors. I pulled the blinds, but the feeling didn't leave. It grew. Kelly sat by the window, peeking out through the crack between the blinds. She didn't say anything for a long time, neither did I, until she asked the question that still haunts me. "Ethan, when did the lights turn back on?" I looked around. The other RVs, dark minutes ago, were glowing softly, but not with the warm yellow of interior lamps. It was blue, faint and cold, like the glow of a television screen in an empty room. We didn't sleep that night. I don't think we ever saw the sun rise. By morning, the RV park looked normal again. The people returned, friendly and cheerful, as if they had been there all along. When I asked the park manager about the storm, he gave me a strange look and said there hadn't been any tornadoes in the area. No storms, no warnings. I showed him the alert on my phone, but the message was gone. Kelly refused to talk about it after that day. I never found out what I saw, or what saw me. But sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I swear I still hear that dragging sound in the distance. Yellowstone National Park holds a strange kind of quiet at night. The kind that presses down on you until your heartbeat feels like the loudest thing for miles. I should have known better. I had heard stories, seen the viral threads about strange encounters in national parks. But nothing prepares you for it when it happens to you. June of 2023 was when I took the RV out to Yellowstone. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted solitude. Just me, the open road, and the trees. I am not the kind of guy who does well in crowds. The RV was my escape pod, a cocoon I could take into the wilderness where no one could reach me. Yellowstone seemed perfect. Vast, isolated, and humbling in the way only nature can be. I pulled into the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, slanting through the trees, and the ground shimmered with the heat left over from the day. I chose a spot right at the edge of the campground, where the forest bled into open space. I liked the view. Nothing but pines and distant mountains, a small stream barely visible through the brush. There were other campers, but not many. Most people seemed to stick closer to the center of the site. I wanted to be on the outskirts. Alone, setting up the RV was routine. I unfolded my chair by the fire pit and started stacking logs. As the sun dipped lower, the other campers' fires began to pop up like scattered stars across the field. Their laughter and conversations drifted faintly on the wind. A reminder that, even in isolation, people still lingered nearby. It felt comforting at first. I had been staring at the flames for an hour when I saw him. Across the clearing, maybe 70 yards away, just beyond the last RV, there was another fire. The camper sat in one of those collapsible chairs, the kind that sink when you sit down. His fire was smaller than mine, barely aglow. I could barely see him. Just a silhouette hunched forward slightly, arms resting on his knees, his face hidden. I remember feeling strange about it right away. Something was off. The others at the campground laughed, cooked, and moved around. But he didn't. He just sat there. No movement. No adjusting the fire. Not even a flick of his head toward the night sky. I tried to ignore it. I reasoned that maybe he was lost in thought, maybe reflecting on life. But the longer I watched, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It wasn't until my fire started to burn down that I realized he was still there. Same position. Same exact stillness. I kept glancing over as I doused my flames and retreated inside the RV. The blinds came down fast, and I locked the door behind me, but sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, in the cramped bed, listening to the faint crackle of his fire through the window. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke up suddenly at 2:13 a.m. I know because I checked the clock the second I opened my eyes. The RV was colder than it should have been. I shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around me, but something felt wrong. You know that primal feeling? That sense of being watched? It hit me hard. I lay there, holding my breath, listening to the kind of silence that feels too thick. And then I heard it. Tap. 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 3 soft knocks on the side of the RV. I didn't move. My body locked up completely. My mind tried to rationalize it. Wind. A branch. But deep down, I knew better. The knocks came again. Slower this time. Tap. 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 I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, knife in hand, and tiptoed to the small window by the door. I hesitated. I didn't want to look, but curiosity pulled me forward. I pressed my fingers against the blinds and lifted them just enough to peer through the gap. The fire across the clearing was gone, but he wasn't. He stood right outside my RV, maybe 15 feet away, partially obscured by shadows. I couldn't see his face, only the shape of his head, tilted slightly, like he was listening. I dropped the blinds instantly and stepped back. My heart pounded so hard, I thought I might pass out. I gripped the knife, standing there in the dark, sweat trickling down my spine. I must have stood there for over an hour, not moving, not breathing, until finally exhaustion took over, and I slid back into bed without turning my back to the door. Morning came slow. I stepped outside, coffee trembling in my hand, trying to shake the icy weight from my chest. The campground felt different in daylight. Peaceful, almost. I forced myself to walk toward where his fire had been. Nothing. No ashes. No footprints. Just undisturbed dirt and pine needles. But there was something else. Resting on the seat of his empty chair was a photograph. I picked it up with shaking fingers. The edges were curled, weathered by time. In the center was an old RV, identical to mine, parked right where I had set up the night before. And standing next to it was a figure, a man, hunched forward slightly, arms on his knees, staring straight into the camera. I left that afternoon. I didn't pack carefully, didn't even clean the fire pit. I drove until Yellowstone was behind me, and I haven't been back since. Sometimes, though, late at night, I hear soft taps on my bedroom window. I never check. Some things are better left unseen. My name is Tom Wilkins. I have always had a fascination with the unexplained, though I never thought I'd find myself tangled in one of its dark threads. Years ago, I worked for a small publication in New England, covering local history and folklore. It was during the time I stumbled across the story of Paula Jean Weldon. Or rather, it stumbled across me. I hadn't set out to investigate her disappearance. I was simply looking for material, an old legend, a ghost story, something that would fill my weekly column. But once I began digging into her case, it consumed me. There was something about her, about the way she vanished, that got under my skin. And by the time I set foot on the long trail in Vermont, retracing her steps, I was no longer just a curious journalist. I was something else, someone desperate to find answers, even if they meant confronting something I didn't understand. It was December 1st, 1946. Paula Jean Weldon, an 18-year-old sophomore at Bennington College, had decided to take a hike along the long trail. She was smart, driven, and fiercely independent, qualities I came to admire as I pored over old police reports and interviewed those who still remembered her. That Sunday afternoon, she left campus wearing a red jacket, jeans, and sneakers. It wasn't the kind of attire you'd expect for hiking in the Vermont wilderness in late autumn. But Paula wasn't known for backing down from a challenge. Witnesses saw her walking toward the trailhead. She seemed cheerful, carefree even. A local couple, the Rileys, claimed they had seen her a few miles into the trail. She'd asked them how far it went, and they told her about the summit up ahead. They were the last people to see her alive, or at all. When Paula didn't return to campus that evening, her roommates assumed she'd simply lost track of time. But when another night passed without a word, panic set in. Search parties combed the trail, helicopters scanned the dense forest from above, and bloodhounds were brought in to track her scent. Nothing. No footprints, no articles of clothing, no sign she'd ever been there beyond those brief sightings. Paula Weldon had vanished. It was this chilling void, the complete lack of answers, that drew me to the case. By the time I started my research in the late 1970s, her disappearance had become a cold case, relegated to history books and whispered rumors. Some believed she'd fallen victim to foul play. Others whispered about the supernatural, the so-called Bennington Triangle, where strange disappearances were said to happen. I didn't believe in any of that. Not at first. The Long Trail is one of the oldest hiking paths in the United States, winding through Vermont's Green Mountains for over 270 miles. I arrived in early December, the same time of year Paula disappeared. The weather was bitterly cold, and a thin layer of snow covered the ground. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. I retraced Paula's route, starting from the trailhead near Bennington. It wasn't long before I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything concrete, just a sense that I wasn't alone. The deeper I went into the woods, the stronger it grew. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I had been reading about her disappearance for weeks, immersing myself in every detail. But when the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, that feeling of unease became impossible to ignore. About 5 miles into the trail, I came across an old, dilapidated cabin. It wasn't on any map, and it didn't look like it had been used in decades. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the windows were shattered, their jagged edges glinting in the fading light. I don't know why I went inside. Curiosity, maybe. Or something else. Something I couldn't quite name. The air inside was heavy, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. In one corner, I found an old rusted stove, and in another, a pile of rotting wood that might have once been a bed. And then I saw it. A flash of red, half buried under the debris. My heart stopped. I reached down and pulled it free. It was a piece of fabric, torn and faded, but unmistakably red. The same red as Paula's jacket. As I stood there, clutching that scrap of fabric, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. There was a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of wind through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. I turned toward the doorway, expecting to see someone there. But there was no one. Only the darkening forest and the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself I was imagining things. I shoved the fabric into my pocket and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. That's when I saw them shadows moving among the trees. They weren't shaped like animals or people. They were wrong, twisted, and they didn't move with the rhythm of the wind. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I stayed at a small motel in town. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows, heard the whispers, and then there were the dreams. In one, I was back on the trail, walking deeper and deeper into the woods. I could hear someone calling my name, their voice faint and desperate. "Tom, help me." I woke in a cold sweat, my hands trembling. But the worst part wasn't the dream itself. It was the feeling that it wasn't a dream at all. That somehow, Paula was out there calling for help. The next day, I went into town to talk to some of the locals. Most of them were tight-lipped, unwilling to discuss Paula's disappearance. But one man, an old-timer named Henry, agreed to speak with me. "She's not the only one, you know," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "People have been disappearing around here for years. It's the woods. They're different." "Different how?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Fear? Pity? "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said. "Sometimes the woods take people, and they don't give them back." Despite his warning, I couldn't stay away. Something about that fabric, those shadows, kept pulling me back. I returned to the trail, this time determined to find answers. I hiked further than before, deeper into the wilderness. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but they seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me. And then I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it was a woman, standing just off the trail. She was wearing a red jacket, her blonde hair glowing in the faint sunlight. "Paula," I whispered. She turned toward me, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were empty, her face pale and gaunt. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. And then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows. I don't remember much about how I got out of the woods. Just flashes trees blurring past, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the whispers growing louder and louder. When I finally stumbled back to my car, I felt like it aged 10 years. I didn't go back to the long trail after that. I don't remember much about how I got out of the woods. Just flashes trees blurring past, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the whispers growing louder and louder. When I finally stumbled back to my car, I felt like it aged 10 years. I didn't go back to the long trail after that. I never found out what happened to Paula Jean Weldon. Maybe no one ever will. But I know one thing for sure. There's something in those woods, something dark and hungry. If you ever find yourself on the long trail, be careful. And if you hear someone calling your name, no matter how familiar it sounds, don't answer.